I'm Kyle Simon.
And I'm Corey Astle.
Welcome to Conservative Minds, a podcast about conservative ideas and thinkers. We explore what it means to call yourself a conservative, where conservatism has been, and where it's going. Each week, we select readings and conduct a discussion to share with you our investigation. Join the conversation by liking us on Facebook or following us on Twitter at ConsMinds, at CONSMINDS. For episode 76, we read What is Conservatism? A collection of pieces edited by Frank Meyer and published in 1964. Joining us to discuss the book this week is Josh Lewis. Josh is the host of the Saving Elephants podcast, a show dedicated to introducing his fellow millennials to the historical and intellectual roots of conservatism in hopes of restoring the Republican Party. So, Josh, welcome. It sounds like your podcast is kind of on the same mission ours is.
That's exactly what I was thinking. This is we started not too long ago, and we were on not all that dissimilar missions of trying to answer the question, what is conservatism? And I'm not sure about you guys, but I still don't feel like I've got that figured out.
Nope, us either. So this book is we read a few episodes back another collection by Meyer, and this one is sort of gets to the point of our podcast and yours. You know, what is conservatism? And this was your suggestion. So maybe just to start us out, tell us why you picked it and what you liked about it.
Yeah, the book What is Conservatism is one of my favorite books for answering the question, because you in the book sort of scratching your head thinking, well, I think I got that, but I'm still a little, I don't want to say the word confused, just you don't feel like you could summarize it in one sentence, right? You don't feel like you could say with absolute certainty, this is conservatism. And I think that was kind of Frank Meyer's point. Frank Meyer's an interesting character. The conservative historian George Nash said of Frank Meyer that he was someone with the ever center of heresy, I think is how he put it. He was someone that was just doggedly determined to point out if someone was a little bit too far in the libertarian or traditional conservative mold. And of course, he's mostly known for fusionism, this infusing or this synthesis between the two, at times what's seen as warring coalitions on the right, the traditional conservative, the social conservative versus the libertarian or the free market conservative. And Meyer was really arguing these two traditions are not at odds with each other. They're actually one and the same. And it's not even conservatism over the last 50 years. We're talking about a project that dates back really to the beginning of Western civilization. And he tried to demonstrate that in this book by pulling together these various essayists or conservatives who wrote these various essays, kind of arguing their various points and saying, well, there's really some grander project here that as much as we disagree, there's actually more in common than there is a divergence.
I think that's right. And it in a way, it seems fusionism seems so natural to us now because we are sort of living in the world of that movement conservatism that came out of National Review and that era of 50s and 60s, figuring out what we were doing. There's two parts to it, though, and I think I'm not sure which is the more important, but he makes the point frequently and I think convincingly that libertarianism and traditionalism, or whatever you want to call the two factions, they both need each other. They're not really opposites. They both believe in freedom and virtue. They place different emphases on it, but they kind of need each other and support each other. But I think there was also at the time this sense of a common enemy. Freedom was under siege from Soviet communism as the Cold War was beginning, and not just the foreign threat, but also at home the growth of democratic socialism, and people saw what it was doing in Eastern Europe and didn't want it here, and that threat of a common enemy, I think, drove these two potentially warring camps into each other's arms a bit, because they both saw that they could recognize something of themselves in the other, but not in that third force that was gaining in power worldwide. It makes me wonder how much the fusionism is of its time and how much it can continue since the end of the Cold War, where we've sort of lost that one factor, but still have these other points that Meyer made that are, I think, still valid.
The most recent guest out of my podcast, Stephanie Slade, the episode's not out yet, but she wrote the article "The Future of Fusionism." I was grateful to get her on the show to talk about this. She kind of takes issue with this whole notion that fusionism can be thought of as the coalition in the Cold War that brought everyone together. And she mentions, as you say, that's correct. That is in a sense what brought us together politically. But she said what Frank Meyer was talking about was actually a philosophical orientation. That it's not a that it would not be correct to think of this as sort of, well, the Cold War is over, so therefore there's nothing more we have in common. And it's obviously a little bit more challenging. We're beginning to see the fusionist, I don't want to call it coalition, but philosophical orientation beginning to phrase somewhat. But it's still no less true in spite of the fact we live in a post Cold War world.
Yeah, that's what really struck me when reading this again. And as Cal said, we've read Frank Meyer before, but how relevant is fusionism today? I guess it still is, because you still have the Paul Ryan wing of the Republican Party, although definitely on the wane, versus the traditionalist side. I think some folks would view maybe the Trump side as more traditionalist, but it's hard to peg because religious value is not really the Trump thing. And so it's almost like, as I was reading through this again, I was thinking to myself, how relevant is it for now? Is it still relevant, or is the battle have the battle lines changed? And whether we call this a coalition or not, I mean, I think I'm sorry, whether Meyer had in mind a coalition or not, I think that's basically what the practical upshot of fusionism is, bringing together a coalition. And fast forward to today, is that the Republican coalition anymore? A conservative coalition? I'm not sure. I put that question to you guys. To me, it's an open question. But
Yeah, I think it's open for sure, just because everything's in flux right now. But I feel like every time I try to figure out where it's going, it comes back to this in a way. Um, I just I it's always going to be two parties just because of the way electoral systems work. Not that it'll be that way every year, but it always coalesces in one party and another. And I don't see any other way to combine. I don't see the libertarian faction going over to the AOCs of the world. I mean,
maybe not. But I mean, you and I have talked about this before a little bit, Kyle. I think during the Bush years, it felt, and in the 90s, it felt like if you were a libertarian, you were for sure a Republican. I'm not sure that's true now. I think most libertarians that I know who would consider themselves strongly libertarian are pretty much voting Democrat now. And so I think that has been a shift, at least anecdotally in my experience. But
Yeah, and I'm kind of with you guys. The second question I don't have an answer to beyond what is conservatism is where are we going from here? And that seems to be kind of an open question that changes daily. But I consider myself to be a fusionist. I still think it's very relevant. I still think it's the appropriate way to look at conservatism. But that doesn't mean that it's guaranteed to carry on into the future. It's entirely possible that we're seeing the end of the fusionist era.
yeah, it is. And maybe it's just a failure of imagination on my part, but I don't see what else you get. I mean, maybe it's that the what we think of as a libertarian tradition is sort of not as significant a factor anymore. And in terms of voters, sure. I mean, we've all seen that plot of where people stand on the different issues, and the three of the quarters of the square were pretty full of people, and then the one wasn't, and that was libertarian. In the 2016 race, we've talked about it on this podcast before. So maybe I think it's possible that maybe that's not as big a factor anymore. Although I think there's more beneath the surface there. I think there are people who, if liberty were actually imperiled in a significant way, and in some ways it is, would come back to those sort of base American values of ordered liberty, emphasis on the liberty, where that's under threat.
what's interesting to me is you have guys like Ross Douthat and Adrian Vermeule and others, Marco Rubio. I mean, I think are heading in a direction of, these are traditionalists. I would characterize them, kind of group them as traditionalists. And instead of looking to the sort of the past fusionist model of coalition with libertarians, it's like they want to dump the libertarians. They want to dump the Paul Ryans and instead replace them with this working class coalition. And I think the 2020 election kind of set set forth a potential vision, which is picking up particularly Hispanic working class. But Trump brought in all these working class whites that either didn't vote at all or voted for Obama, maybe voted for Reagan, that type of thing. We're not a group of folks that you could count on. But suddenly, I think the traditionalists of today are like, well, we don't need them, those libertarians, those Paul Ryans anymore. Let's move in this other direction where we can build this working class / traditionalist party. So I don't know if that is what the future holds, but it is interesting to think, and I think we all stand at the precipice now of like having no idea which direction it's going to go.
Well, and maybe I'm reiterating myself somewhat, but I mean, I'm with you. I don't know which direction it's going to go. Part of the reason I even brought up the book, What is Conservatism? Part of the reason I'm even doing Saving Elephants is I'm not content to just sit on the sidelines waiting to see what direction this goes. I want to be doing what I can as loudly and forcefully within reason as I can to say, this is the direction I think we should be going. And I really think these, I say this often on my podcast, when I start to read these sort of forefathers and the men and women that forged this intellectual tradition, I kind of feel cheated. I've been a lifelong Republican. I've called myself a conservative for as far back as I have any political memory. And yet it's really only been in the last several years that I even knew these voices were out there. When I start reading this depth and this richness of history that conservatism has, it's like, why are we not talking about this more? Like, this contains so many answers to things that we're struggling with today. And sure, some of it, maybe it's outdated, and I'm perfectly happy to have arguments about maybe there's a different direction we can be going, but these voices need to be heard desperately.
I think that's so right. I mean, there is so much there, and especially as even in popular culture, the founding fathers are still. I mean, Hamilton is this popular musical that still is thing people talk about. Why not? That could so easily be leveraged into. Well, let's read about what these guys were talking about and what they were arguing about between themselves. I mean, if you want to jump ahead a little to the Hayek essay here, which is called "Why I Am Not a Conservative." He has some harsh things to say about the conservative traditional wing of things, but he also makes, I think, an important point that matches some of what Meyer and the other people are saying. He says the difference between liberalism and conservatism must not be obscured by the fact that in the United States, it is still possible to defend individual liberty by defending long established institutions. And that's different from most of the world. So I feel like this fusionism has that at its heart, and that's somebody who wants to look to a storied past need look no farther than our founding fathers and our founding documents, where these what were at the time revolutionary things are our heritage and are our tradition. That in itself is something really grand that we should be pushing instead of just some of the low-level crap that passes for political dialogue on both sides. And I mean, on our side as much as theirs, it's all Twitter gotchas and whatnot. And I don't mean that people need to read the entire Federalist Papers to become proper conservatives, although it's worth reading. But there is just giving people the gist of that, I think, unites these two factions of conservatism in a way that nothing else can.
I think that's totally right, and it jumped out at me reading it this time because one of the critiques that I always hear from the left is that conservatives love the founding so much, but during the time of the founding, you absolutely would have been on the side of King George or whatever. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure the conservatives, as described by Hayek, that is what must be a 1950s version of European conservatives, which is just really not recognizable to me. But if we're talking about conservatism as a temperament and a style of not wanting change, well, maybe that is the case. But I think you're right, Kyle, that the legacy that we have of conservatism today, and this is part of our investigation, but it really is that what we want to preserve is not whatever is currently in vogue or currently in power. Whatever authority is in power, we want to preserve it. That's not our brand of conservative. Certainly not mine. But this constitutional government classical liberal conservatism. That's what we're trying to preserve. That's what we're trying to carry forward, and that's what we're trying to slow the, in my mind, the destruction of it by the radical left moving in a collectivist direction.
I find it funny that in a book entitled "What Is Conservatism," with contributors that are all arguing for their viewpoint, that right in the middle of it, you get this essay, "Why I Am Not a Conservative."
Yeah, I thought that was great.
But as a conservative, when I read Hayek's essay, I'm mostly in agreement with it. There's a few fine points I might pick apart here or there, but two thoughts, and Colin, I appreciate you saying this. So this is Jonah Goldberg's point. He talks about this essay all the time, and he constantly says, a lot of people misunderstand this because in multiple places in the essay, Hayek kind of allows for the possibility that, in the United States, most of this critique may actually not be applicable because they don't have the same European conservative traditions that run counter to the liberal democracy here in the US we're trying to conserve. That being said, I think this is a deeply appropriate essay because it actually synthesizes very well with what a lot of these other essayists were saying. They use different words to say this, but they try to distinguish between conservatism as a mere temperament or disposition, which they acknowledge can have value to it. But they say there's a difference between that and a more intellectual or philosophical orientation. And I forget which one of the essayists is that says this, but says something to the extent that a lot of people who are conservative have some idea in mind of what it is they're trying to conserve. And it's not just a simple matter of, the famous phrase, William F. Buckley, the conservative is the man who stands athwart history yelling stop. And I think that's helpful, but I think it's an insufficient understanding of conservatism. And the reason I say I think Hayek's essay is a good fit for this book is because one of the dangers of conservatism, one of the temptations, is that it can just become a reactionary, just say no, just let's apply the brakes, let's just stop going where we're going. And it actually takes an awful lot of work and that sort of moral imagination that Russell Kirk often talked about to try to cultivate, well, what is the actual world where we would hope to move toward and how conservatism get us there?
Yeah, I think that's quite right, and I think it also shows Meyer's broad-mindedness in seeking out the answer to the question that he put such an essay in there. But you're right, it's not completely out of bounds. It's not. I mean, it's not like putting a socialist essay in here. Here's just somebody who's on pretty far to one side of the coalition, but he's definitely on our side. And I think you mentioned Russell Kirk, and we read his essay in this book too, called "Prescription, Authority, and Ordered Freedom." And he talks about this difference, and I think this is something that, again, we could be clearer about, is that there's a difference between authority and authoritarianism, and that there's a difference between accepting tested authority, accepting tradition, and just blindly following whatever. But this is a point we come back to a lot on this podcast. It's hard to draw the line about where that division is, and that's part of being in a movement that is not utopian, that is not strictly ideological in the way that socialism is, in the way that some maybe theocratic movements are. Is that sort of balancing, and that's, again, that is tradition. I mean, tradition is we talk about Burke's views on tradition as the collected wisdom of generations, and that's what Kirk is talking about here. He quotes Burke several times in the essay, and that is not an easy thing to understand. And as he and Burke both talked about, you being traditionalist doesn't mean you never change. It just means you change slowly and thoughtfully. That's still not a great guide to action if you want a simple answer, and that's why there's a whole book about it, and we're still talking about it. And but it's the right answer, I think. But it's not the satisfying simple answer that if you were searching for some political thing that that feels right to you, this one takes a little more thought, and it takes a little more effort and discussion, and we're all going to get things wrong on the way to finding the right answers here, and that's humbling. But I think that's the essential part of what the answer has to be.
And I think we have the more difficult task if you compare with the left, because what you've just described, and you've described it before very well, Kyle, and I'm going to quote you as conservatism is like, do this, but not too much. Fusionism is essentially like, we need to have freedom and liberty, but not too much, because we also need tradition. And tradition is sort of like we need to carry on the wisdom of the ages, but not so much that we can't move forward. Versus here's Kirk talking about the left. He says, from its beginning, the liberal movement yearned for the destruction of all authority. The early liberals were convinced that once they should overthrow established governments and churches, supplanting them by rational and egalitarian and purely secular institutions, the principal problems of the human condition would be near solution. Poverty, ignorance, disease, and war might then be terminated once enlightened self-interest, popular suffrage, and utilitarian public policies have triumphed. Now, we obviously know that this has been completely discredited, but if you're on the side of more, push, and you never saw a program that you didn't want to fund, spending into oblivion versus yes, let's spend, but not too much, yes, let's spend, but let's pay for it, or maybe we shouldn't spend in that way. Being the kind of the party or whatever, sort of saying, like, well, maybe we can't quite go that far. Maybe we shouldn't, like let's be prudent versus just fast and pushing and tearing down any and all institutions, any and all norms, any and all conventions that stand in the way. In some ways, I know that the left and the AOCs of the world are live in a constant state of frustration and neurosis of the fact that they can't move as fast as they want to. But ultimately, they win most of these battles over the long run because we can only slow it so far. And conservatives are on the side of like, not so fast. Okay, we want the society to change. We can't be locked and in rigor mortis. But on the other hand, we can't move so quickly. So I think in some ways it might be more frustrating for the left because they can't move as fast as they want. But on the other hand, it's the easier task because you know what you're going to do, and there's no second thought. It's just push.
I think one of the things that draws me to conservatism is the amount of sort of truths held in tension. And maybe it's just a personality quirk, I don't know, but to me it just feels like it fits reality so much better than most programmatic or leftist ideological um, ideas. They seem a little too cookie cutter, a little too neat around the edges. And Kyle, you mentioned Russell Kirk's contribution here and that emphasis on tradition and authority. His essay is wedded with Wilmore Kendall. Kendall and Kirk very strongly disagreed with each other, in spite of the fact that in this book they're kind of arm in arm arguing on the same side, if you will. Chiefly, I think Wilmore Kendall had a big issue with how much Russell Kirk elevated Edmund Burke, instead of looking more towards like an American kind of definition to root conservatism in. And just all sorts of things throughout, we're talking about American conservatism. We're trying to conserve a liberal revolution. I mean, that's just a head scratcher. How do you conserve a liberal revolution? That's almost a contradiction in terms. But I think this synthesis between authority, tradition on the one hand and liberty, to me, fits with reality as I know it.
I think that's right, and that is a good way of putting it. I think about conserving a liberal revolution, and you can see it in a lot of things. I think after the French Revolution, they just started the calendar over. Like this was year one, everything's new, and then you had that in Soviet countries. I think they tried to do that. They talk about it's the 66th year of the revolution because it was an ongoing revolution. It was a constantly changing, progressing thing. And if you look at some early American documents, they sometimes talk that way. They say, in the 13th year of the Republic, but nobody really leaned on it that much because I think it's too cookie cutter. It's not, it wasn't in the founding fathers' nature to say, we're just going to sweep away everything, even the calendar. People say, yeah, but that's not how. I've got a calendar on the wall of my kitchen. It doesn't say that. So we're just going to keep doing it the same because that's the thing about tradition is it fits humankind because it's evolved around us. It's it's the sum of our knowledge, and when it changes, it only changes because we change, not because we are being changed. And that maybe that's distinctly American, and that is kind of what our podcast is meant to look at is not just conservatism worldwide, although we've certainly read non-American authors frequently, but it's really about, what is conservatism in this country? Because it is different. And I think we're more like Europe and they're more like us than we used to be, just because of the way the frontier is closed and things have changed. And, we're more of a settled society than we once were, but we're still so different. And, we don't have that aristocracy hanging over us. We don't have the past, the 1,000 years of blood and soil nationalism. We've got our tradition, which is, based in liberty, based in turning things over, but just not every year, just the once.
Yeah, I agree with you guys that is a good way to say it, that we're preserving the liberal revolution. I think what we're also conserving is a sense of some higher level authority, some something something beyond us that has some objective truth, some metaphysical sort of objective direction to guide a society. In the traditional wing, it's certainly the God and religion, but we also have, natural law is a deep conversation on the conservative side, as well as the Constitution itself. Here's something that we could set apart and point to and say, okay, this is our guiding light that stands a little bit outside of us. Versus on the left, the project that they've undertaken is to just tear each one of these things down. And I personally believe that that's one of the reasons we find ourselves in the predicament that we do today, because there is no higher authority that we can point to anymore that people agree on. And we're not even just talking about Walter Cronkite on the evening news that everyone shares, but there's belief in God, or I think folks on the left would just as soon like dump the Constitution if it got in the way, and living document is another way of saying like this thing is just, it's old, it's there, yeah, it has some use to it, but as long as it's getting in our way, we can change it. We should move beyond it. And the same with natural law, which is sort of tossed. So I think that's another challenge of conservatism, and I think maybe part of conservative temperament, but certainly part of the orientation over the many books that we've read. I think, Kyle, is that is a desire to conserve some higher authority, something that we can all point to as authoritative, that can kind of guide the society and be wisdom for the ages. But it's becoming more and more difficult.
Russell Kirk, in his list of 10 conservative principles, identifies that, I don't think accidentally or unintentionally, as the very first one.
Mm-hmm.
That the first conservative principle being the existence of a higher moral order. I think he uses words to that effect, if not exactly. That the moral order was made for man or humanity. The moral order was made for humanity, and humanity was made for it. Now, there's a lot of disagreement. What does that mean? Are we talking explicitly Christian? Are we talking about God?
Mm-hmm.
But I think there is an underlying thread within conservatism itself, that there has to be some sense of an objective outside of our just subjective personal opinion. What is the phrase? Live out your truth. That's not a conservative idea.
No.
Right. We don't each get to pick truth. That conservatism has to be rooted in this notion that there is an objective truth with a capital T.
Yeah. Last week we read Herbert Marcuse's book, which is one of the non-conservative books we've been reading the past couple of years, and that is that's the thing that stood out the most to me, is that whole movement is not just against tradition, but it's against the idea of objective truth, and it's so alien to people, I think, that it's hard to see it ever catching on. Although, I mean, the things that descend from that movement are now sort of abroad in society, with critical race theory and other descendants of that sort of postmodern thing, where it's local knowledge and, my truth, your truth, everybody's truth. Well, not everybody's truth, somebody's truth. It feels alien to the human experience. I mean, it feels more alien than Marxism did, where at least Marxism was meant to be realist. I mean, I think they got a lot of things wrong, but it was based on Earth. It was based on humans. It didn't work for real humans, but it was meant to. it was meant to be universal, which at least we could understand. But it's the way the left has gone so sort of out of bounds. Again, I think that's why I think fusionism will eventually be recreated in when this reshuffling is all over. And there might be a few different groups fused together, but just, you know, the left used to talk about the reality based coalition, but now there is no there is no universal reality coalition, and that seems like it can't stand. It seems like most people are not going to get into something that's so far from tradition, so far, right away. And I think that Corey, when you mentioned the Constitution too, it occurs to me just now that that sort of reflects that same conservative sentiment about change. Is we don't worship it as holy writ. We don't see it as the immutable word of the founders that can never be questioned. But to change it is hard. So it's
Yeah.
got that it's
Yeah.
got that presumption towards tradition as it becomes a tradition, but it's not absolute. And I guess they tried to sort of do the same thing Burke was talking about. Whether they did it, well, not. I mean, Burke was their contemporary, so I mean, I don't know that they were basing it off of him, but they had the same kind of idea. The idea that we should keep things the same, but if there's a great need to change it, we can do so as long as there's broad enough agreement across many different levels and factions in society. I think that's why it fits us so well in a way. And when people say, like you were saying, people say, oh, if you conservatives were around back then, you'd be against all this. You would have been Tories. You would have been for King George. Well, we can be for the Constitution while admitting, and I think everybody, I'm sure the three of us and everybody listening who has studied that thing probably has something they would change about it. And I don't think that's an unconservative thought. I just think doing it the right way, doing it with broad consensus and thought is what makes it conservative.
Yeah. In many ways, I mean, I think that's what's keeping America together, because just imagine if there was no Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think God has already been torn down. I think natural law has been torn down. Kirk has a great quote in his book. Says in his essay, "Men do not submit long to their own creations. Standards erected out of expediency will be demolished soon enough, also out of expediency." And I think that's exactly right, because if this conversation about kind of our social media, public media conversation about we can't agree on the same facts, I certainly agree that that is a major problem. But that's a symptom of the larger problem, which is we can't agree on any meaning at all. We can't agree on any objective truth. We can't agree on any fundamental objective understanding that we share together. We can't agree on the most basic things, and I think that has serious implications for stuff that doesn't matter, like whether whatever Twitter outrage of the day is accurate or isn't. But it's clear, though, that if we don't have things we can agree on, and I think the Constitution still remains something that we can generally agree on. I don't know about by the time my kids are our age, or certainly our grandkids. Will it have been undermined to an even greater extent by then? I mean, probably so. And what could replace any of this with? And whatever's replaced, whatever we replace it with, is certainly going to be demolished soon enough, as Kirk says. Also out of expediency. So, I mean, that's a downer of a comment, but to be honest with you, that's probably my greatest concern. Moving forward.
Yeah, I'm with Yuval Levin. I'm neither optimistic or pessimistic about the future. I'm hopeful about the future. I think we have good reasons to think that good things could happen, but that it's not guaranteed, right?
Mm-hmm.
We don't really know what the future holds.
Yeah.
But and kind of thinking of Kyle, what you had mentioned, um, there is something so alienating about, and I enjoyed that episode you guys did with Mark Huza. I think that was an excellent. I like the fact you're getting into leftist books also, because I think that's helpful to piece that all together to even understand conservatism. But there is something very alienating about it, and I completely agree that I think these sort of post-truth or pick your own truth world we live in isn't going to stand. The problem is ideas, even really bad ideas, can sure stick around for a whole heck of a long time.
Yeah.
before it eventually falls apart. So it's entirely possible, Corey, to your point, that we are going to see a diminishing of the authority of the Constitution, of the ordered liberty society we live in, and when our kids get to be our age or our grandkids get to be our age. And maybe eventually that'll change, but there's no guarantee it's going to happen anytime soon.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's yeah, it's troubling because you think it's lasted this long, that should mean something. But again, we're on the side that values tradition, and not everybody does. And that's kind of the point when we read those lefty books, is to sort of see it from their point of view if we can. They don't care about tradition because and that's, that seems, I don't mean to be dismissive. But it's just not, it doesn't carry the same weight. It often carries a negative weight for them. The idea, well, that's how they did it, but they did a lot of awful things, and it's true there were a lot of awful things in the past. I mean, they're not wrong about that, but it's still, I mean, even Hayek admits that the idea of not of a presumption against destroying things is useful. And he is, as the essay says, not a conservative, but he says, that temperament can have value, even to one who is not necessarily inclined to keep everything. But I think that is, I mean, we talk a lot about ideas, but I think as a pure political matter, as a practical matter, I think that's how we win. Is because most people don't want to tear down everything in this country. It's pretty good.
Yeah.
I mean, we all have problems and we all have things that we would change. And even those of us who are very happy with our tradition often see that, it has been applied unevenly in the past and that we should do better in the future. But that is still kind of a strain of traditionalism, because what we're applying is those liberal values that are the American tradition. So I think that can be, if you're talking about where is conservatism going, I think that can be a rallying point, is just not burning everything down. And it seems simple, but it's a good place to start.
So, Josh, what are you optimistic about? I'd love to hear. I mean, we have episodes where we're more or less optimistic. This one feels a little less optimistic. I'm not sure why, but I know that you're forward thinking. And what excites you? And I mean, let me pose it this way: I constantly hear the critique that on the right there's just no new ideas and there's nothing happening except Trump worship. And certainly there is Trump worship happening. I'm not going to deny that. And what makes you optimistic, or who do you view? You could name a person or some ideas that are out there that are fresh or exciting for you. I mean, give us reason for the listeners, reason for optimism.
Reasons for hope, right? I can easily give you a lot of reasons to be pessimistic, but two things spring to mind. One is this book itself. What is conservatism? As I kind of alluded to this earlier, these individuals, Kirk and Gilmore and Meyer, if you read about their lives, they fought each other a lot. And there was even this open question: is fusionism even a thing? Is it just something that, Meyer's pulling out of the air? But this ended up being, this book was written in 1964. I believe this is the same year that Goldwater lost LBJ, when conservatism was, in a lot of ways, in a political sense, still a very nascent movement. But about a decade later, William F. Buckley made the comment that fusionism, in a sense, won, that it was the defining moment of conservatism. It took a while. It wasn't obvious. And I think we're hearing this moment again. I really think that some of the nationalist populist, some of the, I wouldn't even call it Trump worship, because and I'm not trying to denigrate them necessarily, but I don't think it's necessarily even appropriate to include them in the conversation of what is conservatism. But I think there's a lot of voices out there sort of straining against this fusionism. I don't think they're in the majority. And I think we may have some rocky road ahead of us, especially electorally speaking. I definitely don't have a lot of reason for optimism in the near future. But when you read books like this and you think about how, Goldwater losing to LBJ, that was one of the most lopsided electoral defeats in United States history. And 2 decades later, we begin the Reagan Revolution. Now that history is sort of unknown. Like, what happens next, I don't know. But I have to believe that there is a lot of, I think we're really on the precipice of sort of another wave, if you will, of trying to figure out how do we build institutions? how do we stay within this ordered liberty? And there's going to be a lot of collateral damage in the process. But I think we're just at the beginning of starting this battle all over again.
I I think you're right. I hope you're right. And I think there's even in this current realignment a lot of hope for success, because I think a lot of people who were lifelong Democrats are sort of reconsidering in light of the increasing leftward tilt of that party, and that's why we're bringing in a lot of, I mean, union members were not traditionally in our party. Oh, but a lot of what we're talking about now, talking about intermediary institutions, talking about the virtue of work, these are things that if if we're the only ones talking about them, it gives us a lot in common with people who didn't used to vote our way, but share a lot of our values in everyday life. And I think I was listening to Ben Dominich's new podcast, where he was talking with David Shore, the I don't know what you call him, pollster, political analyst, just about who shifted where in the last couple elections, and I think we're breaking through in a lot of areas of people who are traditionally Democrats, but are sick of the just kind of over the top, unreality, un not just unconservative, but untraditional, unmoored from American tradition sort of thing. I think most Americans are happy with this country, even if they aren't, think there's occasional flaws. And so I think there's reason for optimism there, but also there's no predicting politics. We don't know who our next presidential nominee is, and that seems to be all that matters in the way our imperial system is coalescing around the White House. So, I mean, I think I like what you said earlier. It's not optimistic, not pessimistic, but there's reasons to hope, and there's messages that should the powers that be choose to emphasize them, could be wholesome, beneficial, virtuous, and also win elections.
We got to remember too that after Watergate, the Democrats had a wave, and it lasted about a cycle and a half, and then it was back, right?
Mhm.
So, and no one, including me, thought that Trump would beat Hillary in 2016. Electoral politics are funny and incredibly unpredictable. And I mean, we were talking about the Tea Party only a couple years ago, and now that seems like a distant, faint memory. But I think Josh, your scenario is pretty plausible. Any closing thoughts for us? Thanks for joining us. It's been awesome.
Mm-hmm.
You're a smart guy, and I think the world benefits from your show and from the conversation. But what do you want to leave us with?
I have never come up with a good answer to that question. I'm gonna have to work on my elevator pitch for closing thoughts. But I just want to say it has been a lot of fun talking to you guys, and I would say the same to you. I really enjoy your podcast. I think you're doing God's work. Going through these books that, quite frankly, probably the majority of your listeners do not have the time and will never take the time to read, but they can get those nuggets out of them that you offer forth, and I think we all benefit. And I'm trying to do the same thing at Saving Elephants. Check us out there. We try to have similar conversations. Recognize that most people listening are probably not oddballs like Corey, Kyle, and I that don't just eat, breathe, and sleep this stuff and have other things to do with our lives. So it's been a lot of fun talking to you guys, and keep up the good work.
Thank you. Thanks a ton, listeners. Get that on your podcast app. Saving Elephants. Josh Lewis. He's a stud. All right, that's it. That's Frank Meyer. Catch us next time.